Welcome to our last installment of our look at the timeline. This is going to be where we look at the Common Era documents, which are written and compiled up to about right before 700 Common Era. This is important. Before we get into all that, know that this particular segment is going to have lots of information and several slides. So consider that as we go through it. We want to wrap it up all in one shot, and then we're going to go over and look at our gospel. Remember that everything that we've done on our timeline is done according to the temple events. Here is that slide. Remember that in addition to the temple events, we looked at the six, and we went all the way from King Cyrus all the way over to Rabbi Yeshua, or Jesus. So take a look at that timeline information one more time. After we looked at the six, we went in there and we took a look at all of the document information from the Hebrew, the Aramaic, and the Old Testament Greek, and we looked at it on the timeline. And we put it in according to a box, and we said it went basically from King Cyrus down to Jesus and the apostles. So once again, take a look at that information as that information is put inside a box. Now we're going to look at Common Era documents. And you can see on this timeline, according to where the box is, it still is right around Jesus. And this is actually quite significant. The last slide dealt with the context of Jesus and backwards, and the apostles and backwards in time. And this box deals with Jesus and the apostles and moving forward in time. And you can tell just by these two boxes that this is a different piece of information, and they're working with different information when it comes to the scriptures. So let's look at this content of this box. There are going to be four boxes I'm going to put within this larger box, and we're going to look at them one by one. And this is really a huge, if I can use that word, compacting of these elements and the developments during this time frame, from Jesus and his death up to the development of the New Testament canon, which is way down here, okay? So let us take a look at our first box. We're going to, in the large box, we're going to put another box. Here's that slide. In that box, the large rectangle, is another small square box. That one is between Common Era 50 and 150. Now the reason that box is there is because that is when scholars have estimated that the New Testament is being written. So Apostle Paul, Apostle Peter, James, John, Matthew, these guys are writing the information around that time period. Now, there's lots of arguments and lots of disagreements about when they wrote and how they wrote and all this kind of stuff. That information is beyond the scope of what we're talking about. But the box itself reveals this is where it was written. So this is important. All of the Gospels that we know of in the canon that we have were written in this basically 100-year span, which is after Jesus. And we saw last time in our study that Jesus was working with all of this information back here, and that was his scriptures, and Paul was using this information to write, and Peter is as well. So the first church right there at Jerusalem, as they're writing all of this information and they're sharing this, because the first believers were Jews, that's where the gospel was first preached, was at Pentecost in Jerusalem. These people are working with the scriptures that we looked at, all this information back here. Now this is going to change just a little bit as we get into our next three segments. So take a look at what's going to happen. Here is going to be our next box. Take a look at our next slide. Is the writing down of the Mishnah, which is considered a writing down of the oral law. So you have the written law, which is the law of Moses, and it's way back here with Moses, and then it gets transferred down and it's put on papyrus and scrolls and all this kind of stuff, and transferred down through history. And it's usually on a large paper scroll that moves from one side to the other. Now, what you have with the Mishnah is a recording of the dialogue about the oral law. And if you remember our conversations, I said Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Shammai had an influence on this document. So some of their teachings are right here in this document, and Rabbi Yeshua's teachings is in what we just saw in our last slide, which was the writing of the New Testament, specifically recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. So you have this information. So you have the New Testament writings that get written, and you have the Mishnah that gets written down, which is a transmission of the oral law and is still influential in case decisions and studies within Judaism. Now, these are major things, and we're just distilling it down to some essential elements so we can keep our discussion of the timeline pretty small and focused. But let us take a look at our next slide. So let's look at that slide. That particular slide has a box around 200 to 380, if I remember right. And what it is it is a recording of the pre-Latin and the information that's put into the Latin Vulgate. So I don't know as much about the Latin because I don't read it, I don't study it, but it is important to the development of the New Testament text because you have to understand how, especially if you're a Protestant. If you are a Protestant Christian, the Latin text was what the church used up until the 1100s, 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, and you have the beginnings of the Wycliffe Bible, and you get it starting to be translated over to English, and you have a whole amount of war that takes place because of going from Latin to English. But that's a different part of history that we're not going to study. And you can go look at my Bible series and you can see some of that discussion. But what we have here is back there you had the writing of the New Testament, then you had the writing down of the Mishnah, and then you had the writing of the Greek New Testament into Latin. And this is important. So this is what we have. So we have the writing of the New Testament, we have the writing down of the Mishnah, which is Aramaic and Hebrew, and then we have Latin. So we have all of these texts running together and working with each other or against each other depending on which side of the fence you're sitting on. But this is part of history. Now what we haven't discussed is the canonization of the New Testament because it has yet to happen even though you have all of these pre-Latin texts sitting out there. So let's look at our next slide. There's a box on that slide that says from 350 to 692. So those 300 years, you have the knowledge that, hey, these are the 27 New Testament documents that are widely used, and history kind of attests to these things, and it goes through it. So it goes way beyond the scope of my little presentation. But take a look that it's not until the 600s that the New Testament itself is canonized. Now, all of this is really, really important because you and I, as students of New Testament, we have an English Bible, most of us, and we get it, and it's usually 66 books. And we don't realize that there has been so many changes and decisions in church history that's affected that. The 66 books of your Protestant Bible and my Protestant Bible are there because somewhere along the line, the Protestants have decided to take out what's called the Apocrypha in a colloquial expression. But the Roman Catholic Bible has the Apocrypha. But when you go back all the way to Jesus and the apostles, Matthew through Revelation does not exist. So the question is how does Peter, the Apostle Paul, James, John, and Matthew, and all of these other 12 apostles share out the gospel? Now I know I referenced the 12 because there's all the other 12, and I mentioned only some of them. But the reality is they taught the gospel from what we call the Old Testament. They didn't call it the Old Testament, they called it the Scriptures. And when they referred to the Torah, they called it the law of the Lord or the law of Moses. And what we're going to find out in the book of Luke is there's a division right toward the end of the book called the Law, the Prophets, and the Psalms. That is our first hint of a Hebrew canon. And we will talk about that when we get to that particular verse as we go through our studies. So this closes out our timeline. And from this point forward, with our next segment, we're going to be looking at the verses. And we're going to be looking at how they play a role with the decisions of Jesus, his parents, Jesus' teachings, all these things, which we may not consider. Because Jesus, until he dies, lives under the Old Testament. And that's actually very profound when we sit and think about it. So Jesus teaches from the Old Testament, lives under the Old Testament, but it was never called an Old Testament. It was called the Scriptures. And that's what we're going to study as we go through our gospel.